The carriage rattled over the cobbled road, the sound of wheels on stone the only thing louder than the wind stirring the dead leaves scattered across the autumn countryside. Briarwood Hall loomed ahead, the thick ivy clinging to its ancient stone walls like 100 secrets held too tightly in place. The windows, dark and unwelcoming, seemed to watch as Miss Agatha Marple's carriage drew closer, a sullen presence at the edge of the road. The house was as it should be, quiet, dignified and brooding. It was the sort of house that had stories to tell if you cared to listen. Miss Marple didn't know what they were yet, but the hairs on the back of her neck stood up all the same. The horse came to a halt at the door, and the butler appeared without a sound, his face as implacable as the stone walls surrounding them. A brief greeting and a stiff nod was enough. He ushered her inside. She could feel the weight of the air as she stepped across the threshold. The manor's silence clung to her like a fog, thick with history. She didn't mind silence, though. Had learned to listen to it over the years. It spoke louder than anything else sometimes. The hall was grand, of course, an echo of its once proud glory. Chandeliers that could have fed a small village if melted down, rugs so fine they felt like stepping into a different world. Everything in place. The smell of old wood and something faintly floral filled the air, the kind of scent that stuck to the back of your throat. Comfortable, familiar, dangerous maybe if you paid attention. She set her bag down on a nearby table, taking a moment to adjust her spectacles. Her eyes flicked to the portrait on the wall just across from her. A family portrait, identical twins, both well-groomed and smiling, wearing that carefully tailored look that could almost have been mistaken for joy. Almost. But there was something about the way they held themselves, rigid, as if trying to keep their own secrets under wraps. But that wasn't what caught her attention. There, just beyond the two men, in the shadows of the painting, was a third face. It wasn't fully visible, just a blur, like someone had tried to paint over it, or, more likely, erase it. A shadow. A whisper. Miss Marple's fingers brushed the hem of her jacket, her lips pressed into a tight line. She didn't believe in coincidences. Not anymore. Not after all these years of seeing too many things fall apart for reasons that seemed like accidents to most. She'd learned long ago that the little things, the ones you weren't supposed to notice, were the ones that mattered. She tilted her head slightly, trying to ignore the feeling creeping up her spine. A third figure? A third twin? Or just a mistake? Either way, it was something, and in a house like this, something always meant more than it appeared. "Well, Miss Marple," she murmured to herself, "looks like you've found your first clue." The hallway stretched on, its length almost unnerving. The house had that hollow, echoing quality, where each footstep seemed amplified by the sheer size of the place. Yet there was nothing to fill the silence but the soft ticking of a distant clock. The only movement came from the thick curtains drawn across the windows, their fabric slightly shifting with each gust of wind outside. Miss Marple walked slowly, deliberately, her feet moving over the worn rug in soft steps. The manor's opulence was hard to ignore, yet it was the stillness that pressed in, suffocating, as if something unseen was watching. She paused before the next portrait, a larger, more elaborate thing than the last. It was framed in gold, the varnish gleaming under the dim light of the hallway. The subjects were a familiar pair, the same twin brothers from the previous painting, but something was different here. There was a subtle change in their expression, something tense like the calm before a storm. They were still smiling, but their eyes were too sharp, too searching, as if they could see through the viewer. But there it was again. That third figure, a faint outline near the edge of the frame, just barely visible beneath the glossy finish. It was almost imperceptible, and Miss Marple had to lean in close to be sure. A hand, a face, a figure that didn't belong. She pressed her lips together, eyes narrowing as she studied it. This one wasn't even a proper outline. It was as if the artist had been interrupted midway, or had tried to paint over the figure in an effort to hide it, leaving only the suggestion of a person in the shadows. She leaned back, taking a breath. There was something about that third figure that nagged at her. It wasn't just the ambiguity of it. It was the manner in which it was hidden. Like the portrait itself had been altered, deliberately skewed. It wasn't a mistake. It was deliberate. She could already feel the pieces starting to move in her mind, though she couldn't quite see the full picture yet. She didn't need to. But not yet, for now all she had were whispers. With a soft sigh, Miss Marple straightened her coat, glancing around the hallway one more time before continuing down toward the sitting room. The house, like most places of power and wealth, wasn't really full of life. It was full of expectations, full of history, full of lies, and as she moved, Miss Marple knew one thing for certain. If there was one thing this house had, it was a secret, and it wasn't planning on giving it up without a fight. The corridor was too quiet. Miss Marple paused at the end of the hall before a heavy oak door that stood slightly ajar. The scent of old wood mingled with something faintly metallic, probably from the iron hinges that groaned when the wind pushed against them. The manor felt alive, breathing through its cracks and crevices, but it was the kind of breath that felt too controlled, too deliberate. She shifted her weight and crouched down, her gloved hand brushing against the door frame. She was a patient woman, and in this kind of house, patience was a good thing to have. Her fingers brushed the cold wood, and then, just beside the latch, she noticed it. Fine, almost talcum-like dust, spread in a thin, precise line along the edge of the door. It wasn't the dust of neglect. No, this was different. It had the look of something intentionally placed, smeared just enough to be noticed without being too obvious. The pattern wasn't random. Someone had deliberately disturbed the latch, or perhaps left it to appear disturbed. Miss Marple stood up, her gaze drifting over the door, then up to the brass handle, where the dust seemed to have been spread just shy of contact, a small but deliberate touch. Whoever had done it knew the door would be opened sooner or later. She made a mental note of the detail, cataloguing it like a stone dropped into a pond, ripples that would expand once the weight of the case pressed against it. There were too many small disturbances for it to be an accident, too many clues lingering in places where no one bothered to look. The wind howled outside, shaking the glass in the windows as she backed away from the door. Her lips tightened for a moment before she moved on, every step echoing in the emptiness of the manor. She could feel the layers of tension building, one subtle detail at a time. It was almost as if the house itself was holding its breath. The parlour was warm, its plush armchairs and polished wood gleaming under the flickering light of the fire. Miss Marple sat at one end of a low, round table, the scent of strong tea filling the air as she raised the cup to her lips, the porcelain cool against her fingers. The crackle of the fire was the only sound, save for the faint murmurs of conversation that occasionally pierced the stillness from across the room. The Winters family had gathered, as was customary at the end of the day. Their stiff formality filled the room with an invisible weight. There was Lawrence, the surviving twin, seated next to his wife, both of them looking too polished for the hour, their clothes as immaculate as their outward composure. Across from them, Sir Julian Blake, the family's financial backer, lounged with a glass of brandy in hand. His eyes narrowed slightly as he engaged in quiet conversation with Dr. E. Willem Montague, whose sharp features and quiet manner suggested a mind far more interested in ideas than idle chatter. Miss Marple listened carefully, her attention flicking between the faces of the people in the room. There was an unease to their laughter, a forced quality that none of them could quite mask. They tried, of course, but the tension bled through, the undercurrents of past exchanges and unspoken resentments swirling just below the surface. "Tell me, Miss Marple," Sir Julian's voice cut through the hum, smooth and practised, "do you find it as hard to enjoy the quiet of these old houses as I do?" Miss Marple's gaze shifted slightly to him, then down to her teacup, her fingers tapping lightly on its rim. "I find them peaceful," she replied with a quiet smile. "But there's something about a place like this. It has its own sort of rhythm, doesn't it? The walls know more than they're willing to say. Walls don't talk." Lawrence chuckled. There was something brittle in the sound. Not unless you've been here too long, of course." "I don't know," Miss Marple mused, her voice soft. "I think walls, remember. The kind of house that stood this long. Well, it's seen more than we think." There was a slight shift in the room as her words landed. Sir Julian's smile tightened, his gaze flicking toward Lawrence and then back to Miss Marple. The others remained silent, though the tension between them was palpable. "So you believe in memories?" Dr. Montague asked, her voice low, almost disinterested, though the edge of suspicion lingered in the question. She had a way of looking at Miss Marple, sharp, calculating, as if measuring every word. "Oh, I believe in memories," Miss Marple replied calmly, her eyes locking with Dr. Montague's. "And I believe they can have a funny way of finding their way out, even when we try to keep them buried." It was a delicate exchange, like playing a hand of cards without showing your full hand, the kind of words that didn't carry weight unless you knew how to listen for them. Miss Marple leaned back in her chair, letting the conversation flow around her like water, observing it with the quiet precision that had served her for years. The tea grew cold in her cup as she watched the family. Their faces were masks, carefully crafted, but fragile, like paper poised to tear at the slightest touch. Beneath the surface there were too many lies left unsaid. Greed, fear, jealousy. Those were things you didn't have to look hard to find in a place like this, and she knew instinctively that whatever was coming, it would unravel here. It would begin with something small, something forgotten by the others, but she would see it for what it was. Miss Marple's fingers drummed once more against the edge of her cup. There was more to this family than their carefully constructed facades, and in every quiet corner of this house there was a secret waiting for the light of truth. The first light of dawn was creeping in through the heavy drapes of Briarwood Hall, the golden glow seeping into the cold, silent corners of the manor, the kind of silence that makes the place feel like it hasn't seen a soul in years, as if even the shadows had settled into a quiet truce. But that stillness, like all things, was temporary. A scream cut through the air, loud enough to rattle the windows and wake the dead. It was the kind of scream that didn't just startle the body but seemed to shake something deep inside. The sort of scream that made your blood run cold before you even understood why. The household staff, who had already been up with the first hint of light, froze at the sound. The head butler, Mr. Collins, was the first to move, striding quickly down the grand hallway, his polished shoes clicking against the marble floor. The other servants followed in a wave of nervous whispers, hands fluttering at their sides, unsure of what to do, but knowing all too well what had to be done. Miss Marple, already dressed and calm, stepped out from the sitting-room, her expression unreadable. She didn't jump, didn't flinch, she didn't even rush to the scene. Her mind worked fast, sorting through the possibilities with a practiced ease. The scream was from somewhere deep in the manor, somewhere isolated, probably the library. As the staff gathered outside the door, unsure of what to do next, Miss Marple approached them, her voice low and firm. "Everyone stay back," she instructed. "Allow the authorities to do their job." It wasn't that she thought she had all the answers, she didn't. But in moments like this, when panic threatened to take over, Miss Marple knew the only thing to do was wait, observe, and let the scene unfold. The screaming had stopped by the time she reached the library door. The calm after the storm always arrived too soon, like the silence after the wind had blown through. She opened the door and stepped inside. The library was, as expected, a cavern of bookshelves and heavy oak furniture. A space that seemed far too grand for its purpose, but it was clear from the way the light hit the bookshelves that the Winters family had spared no expense. Every shelf was meticulously ordered, though a few books had been knocked askew in the commotion. The grand fireplace, cold and unused, stood in the corner like a silent observer. But it was the body that drew the eye. Victor Winters lay slumped in a chair, his face turned slightly toward the fire, as if he had been sitting there reading, perhaps even dozing, before the end came. There was a starkness to his body, an unnatural stillness that suggested the death hadn't been quick. His arms were slack, his head tilted unnaturally to one side. What caught Miss Marple's eye wasn't just the body, though. It was the door. The heavy oak door, the one that had been bolted from the inside. That was the problem. The door, bolted and locked, was the key to the whole thing. The door had not been forced open. There were no signs of struggle at the entrance. It was as though someone had entered, killed Victor, and then simply locked the door behind them. Miss Marple's eyes swept over the room, taking in every detail with a quiet, methodical precision. The latch on the door was an old-fashioned iron one, sleek and cold, with no obvious signs of wear. It wasn't as though someone had forced their way in. It had been locked from the inside, as if the murderer had stepped out after the deed was done and left no trace of their presence. The room felt like a trap, the kind of trap where nothing was left to chance, where every movement had been calculated. Miss Marple's mind clicked into motion as she walked slowly across the room, her eyes never leaving the body. She noted the small things, the untouched glass of brandy on the table beside Victor, the carefully placed books that had been knocked from the shelf but lay in a neat, almost practised disorder. Nothing was chaotic here. Not yet. It would come, though. The silence between them grew heavier. The only sound was the faint rustling of paper as Miss Marple's fingers grazed the back of a book, her attention focused on the corner of the room where the faintest smudge of dust caught the light. She knelt beside Victor, her eyes catching something on his wrist. A small, almost invisible bruise, like the mark of a hand that had been too tight. Not something that had killed him, but something worth remembering. Her gaze moved back to the door. That lock! She glanced at the staff standing at the threshold, watching her every move with wide eyes, waiting for her to speak. "They'll need to break the door open," she said, her voice steady. "We'll see soon enough." The staff nodded, but none of them moved. They didn't need to. Miss Marple was already working it out in her mind. She could feel the tension building, the knowledge that this wasn't a simple crime, and that it wasn't going to be solved by breaking down a door. This was something else, something darker. The air in the room was thick with the staleness of unused space and quiet, but it was the silence of the locked door that held the real danger. No one had entered, no one had left, and yet someone had died. Miss Marple took a final look at Victor's still body and the door that trapped his death inside with him. Then she turned to the servants, her voice a soft echo in the quiet. "Make sure the door is opened. We'll need to see it all." The servants nodded and left, the heavy sound of their footsteps echoing through the grand hall. Miss Marple stayed behind, her mind already piecing together the fragments of the puzzle. In the stillness of that locked room, something was missing. Something had been hidden, and Miss Marple wasn't about to let it stay hidden for long. The room smelled of stale air and fear. It had only been minutes since the scream had pierced the manor's silence, but it felt like hours. The constabulary had arrived, though their presence hardly did anything to calm the rising tension in the air. Their uniforms, too neat, too official, seemed out of place in the panic-stricken chaos of Briarwood Hall. The family gathered in the hallway, their faces masks of confusion, grief, and suspicion. Miss Marple stood a few feet away, watching. Her expression was the same as always, composed, methodical, like a grandmother who had seen it all, but hadn't yet decided whether to reprimand the children or let them sort it out on their own. Her eyes, however, never stopped moving. Lawrence Winters stood to the side, his hands shoved in his pockets, his jaw clenched tight. His blue eyes darted from one person to the next, but it was his stiff posture that gave him away. He wasn't just grief-stricken. He was scared. A man standing in the middle of his own house, surrounded by those who now looked at him as though he were a criminal. "What do you make of it, then?" a constable asked, glancing up at Miss Marple. His voice was a little too loud, the way people speak when they want their words to carry authority. Miss Marple didn't answer right away. She merely observed. "Not a thing out of place," the constable continued. "The door's locked from the inside. No signs of a struggle, just a man dead in a chair." Miss Marple turned her eyes back to the library door where the murder had taken place. The latch was thick iron, untouched. The bolt hadn't been tampered with. The room had been sealed from within. "Is it locked, then?" someone muttered. "Bolt it," Miss Marple replied softly, but the words cut through the air. The family's eyes shifted back and forth between the detective and Lawrence. Whispers started to grow like the rustling of dead leaves. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to reach Miss Marple. The look on their faces told her all she needed to know. They suspected him, the twin, the surviving one. He was the obvious choice, but Miss Marple didn't care about what was obvious. She cared about what was true. As the constable approached Lawrence, Miss Marple stepped forward, moving in her usual measured, unhurried pace. She didn't need to ask about the locked door, the position of the body, or any of the other superficial details. They were already in her mind, sorted and catalogued, not so much with suspicion as with curiosity. The scene was already forming in her mind, but the question was, which version of the truth would unfold in the end? The constable was speaking to Lawrence now, his words too distant for Miss Marple to catch all of them. Something about where he had been, when he'd found out, whether anyone had seen him during the night. Lawrence's answers were clipped, defensive. Miss Marple watched them for a moment longer before turning her attention back to the library door. Her fingers brushed lightly against the wall beside her. Thoughtful, precise. Her mind already turning over the possibilities. There was one thing that couldn't be overlooked. The lock. It hadn't been forced, and no one had been in the room to see the crime committed. The whispers continued behind her, but she ignored them. Miss Marple stood in the doorway of the library, silent and still. The room was cold now, the fire long since burnt out. It felt more like a tomb than a library. The shelves stretched high above her, each one filled with old books that had seen better days. But none of them mattered now. What mattered was the lock. She focused on the latch again, the faint trail of dust left undisturbed around its edges, the way it clung to the edges of the door as though it had been handled carefully, or perhaps deliberately. There was a subtlety in the way it had been disturbed, a peculiar carelessness in the arrangement, the sort of thing that suggested someone knew exactly what they were doing, but what did it mean? She leaned closer to the door, her fingers brushing the edge of the latch. The grain of the wood felt rough under her touch, but that wasn't what drew her attention. It was the dust. Not the dust itself, but how it had been arranged. If the door had been locked from the inside, why had the latch been touched? And if the murderer had used the hidden passage she suspected was somewhere in the house, why hadn't they taken more care? She didn't know yet, but it was there, a hint, a feeling. She could sense the faint, uneasy hum of the house around her, the silence that pressed down on her like an invisible hand. There was something off, something not quite right, and the more she stood there, the more it gnawed at her. She'd seen it before, the way details didn't quite match up, the way people's words and actions never quite lined up. It wasn't panic or alarm that filled her mind. It was something colder, something more methodical. The facts were scattered, but the answer was there, somewhere. She took a deep breath and pushed the door open fully. It creaked, the sound reverberating through the room like a quiet warning. The body of Victor Winters lay in the chair, his face frozen in a grimace, his body unnaturally still. He looked more like a mannequin than a man, his clothes pristine, his posture rigid. Nothing had been disturbed in the room except for him. Miss Marple glanced back at the door, the latch, the dust. Nothing about the position of the body made sense in the context of the locked room. He hadn't fought back, hadn't tried to escape. It was too calm, too still. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps behind her. She turned slightly to see the constable standing in the doorway, his gaze flicking nervously between her and the room. "Everything in order?" he asked, his voice unsure, as though the question itself was a formality. "Everything is as it should be," Miss Marple replied quietly, her gaze lingering on Victor's face. "But there's something more to this than meets the eye. There always is." The constable nodded, though he seemed no closer to understanding. Miss Marple turned her attention back to the door. She stood there for a moment longer, feeling the weight of the room press in on her. The answer was there, it always was, hidden in plain sight. She just needed to peel back the layers, slowly, methodically, and when she did, she'd find it. The truth, the one thing no one was expecting. The mystery was far from solved, but one thing was certain. Miss Marple wasn't about to leave any stone unturned. Not until the last clue was in place. Miss Marple moved quietly through Briarwood Hall, her presence barely noticed by the staff and family members who scurried about with nervous energy. The house had quieted down after the initial shock of Victor Winter's death, but the air remained heavy with unspoken tension. If there was one thing Miss Marple understood well, it was how secrets clung to people in the same way dust clung to forgotten corners. She began with the servants, as she always did. They were the lifeblood of any household, their eyes and ears more reliable than the often rigid walls of propriety that surrounded the upper classes. The maid, a young woman named Clara, appeared more nervous than usual when Miss Marple approached. Clara had been with the Winters family for just under a year, and she was already well versed in the subtle power dynamics that ruled the manor. Her eyes darted from side to side, clearly avoiding Miss Marple's gaze. "Clara," Miss Marple began, her tone soft and unassuming, "tell me, my dear, what was the household like before Mr. Winters passed?" Clara shifted from foot to foot, wringing her hands. "Quiet, mostly, but the tension, or there's always tension, between the brothers, I mean, Mr. Lawrence and Mr. Victor, they were always, well, not friendly, I'd say. More like two men sharing a house who didn't much care for each other but had to pretend they did." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow but didn't press her further. "And the others, the rest of the household?" Clara hesitated, then glanced over her shoulder, as though checking for any listening ears. "Madam, she's never been the same since they came back from that trip. You know, to Paris. She's always a bit distant now, and Dr. Montague, she spends far too much time with Mr. Victor. If you ask me, that woman has ideas beyond being a doctor." There it was, a glimmer of insight. Miss Marple's smile didn't falter, but she filed away the observation. Dr. Montague, a woman of considerable education and perhaps even more considerable ambition, had been close to Victor Winters. Perhaps too close. The idea of professional ties turning into something more personal wasn't far-fetched. "Thank you, Clara," Miss Marple said, her voice warm. "You've been most helpful." She moved through the halls with an air of indifference, but her eyes caught every detail. The crack in the wallpaper, the dust that hadn't quite settled on the mantelpiece, the nervous glance of the older butler as he worked his way around the family's business. All of it added up to a picture. A family used to hiding things. A house that had seen far too much silence. Later, when the household was occupied elsewhere, Miss Marple found herself alone once again in the study. She stood before the family portrait she had seen earlier, the one of the identical twins, Victor and Lawrence. The faint third figure in the background had bothered her then, and it bothered her now. The study was dimly lit, its shelves filled with well-worn books and the scent of aged paper. She reached for the portrait again, her fingers brushing the smooth frame as she adjusted it slightly for a better view. The third face, hidden at the edges of the picture, wasn't a mistake. It was too deliberate. It wasn't a blur of poor technique, but an intentional omission, carefully obscured by the artist's hand or perhaps even by someone else. The outline of a face, a figure, was there, a ghostly presence almost invisible to the casual viewer. Miss Marple leaned in closer, her eyes narrowing. This time she could make out the faintest hint of an eye, the curve of a cheek, and the sharp line of a jaw, features that echoed Lawrence and Victor's but were distinctly different. This wasn't just an accidental smudge or a forgotten detail. This was something else entirely. A third Winters, a sibling perhaps, someone who had been erased from the family history, tucked away in a corner of this old portrait like some forgotten skeleton. Miss Marple's brow furrowed, her mind working through the possibilities. A third child, long silenced by the family's secrets. Her fingers traced the edge of the frame, feeling the cool, smooth wood beneath her touch. She wasn't sure whether the third figure had been intentionally erased or hidden, but it was there. She would bet her best set of knitting needles on it. The question was, why? And what had happened to them? With a last glance at the portrait, Miss Marple stepped away from the wall and took a slow, deliberate walk around the room. She passed the windows, barely noticing the darkened view of the garden outside, and instead focused on the faint echoes in the house, a family torn apart by jealousy, greed, or something worse. The secret child was the key to this, Miss Marple felt certain of it. But how did it tie into the locked room? Who was the third Winters, and why was their existence erased? The answers were there, hidden in plain sight. She would need to talk to the rest of the household, get more pieces of the puzzle. But she didn't need to rush. The longer she stayed, the more the house revealed itself. The more people spoke when they thought they weren't being listened to. She paused at the door, her fingers brushing the knob. The secrets of Briarwood Hall were deep, and she hadn't even scratched the surface yet. The extra face in the portrait, the strange dust on the latch, the fractured relationships between the family members. It was all leading her somewhere. Somewhere she didn't yet understand, but would soon. For now, though, the only thing she could do was wait and listen. The library was quieter now. The servants had cleaned up, the body removed, and the constable had retreated to confer with his superiors. Miss Marple stood by the window, her eyes tracing the shapes of the trees in the garden, now heavy with dusk. The silence felt heavier than the air, and her mind buzzed with the absence of answers. She had already examined the locked door, noting its intricate design and the familiar yet foreboding feel it left behind. But now she was focused on the forgotten corners, the places people rarely checked when the mystery wasn't pressing, and the library was full of forgotten corners. Her fingers skimmed over the surface of the old desk, papers scattered with an air of disarray that suggested nothing was meant to be seen. But that was always the case in houses like this. Disorder for the eye to gloss over when what really mattered was tucked away where no one thought to look. As she slid the top drawer open, her eyes caught a glimmer of metal, something small. She reached in, her fingers closing around a small, ornate key. It was lighter than she had expected, but the craftsmanship was exquisite. Delicate engravings traced patterns of swirling vines and leaves, their detail fine enough to suggest that this was not just a simple key. The pattern echoed the latch on the library door. She turned it over in her hand, noticing a few subtle marks along the edges, scratches that suggested frequent handling. Not for a door, then. At least not just a door. The key's craftsmanship spoke of something more. Perhaps a forgotten compartment, a hidden entrance, or a secret. She could feel it in the way it fit so perfectly in her palm, a sense of purpose that only added to the mystery. Her mind raced ahead, imagining passages that weren't supposed to be there, hidden doors that hadn't been seen for years. Whatever it unlocked, it wasn't meant to be found easily. She slipped the key into her coat pocket and stood up, scanning the room again. There was more to this house than met the eye, more to the Winters family than they let on. And now, a key to something forgotten, or something deliberately hidden, was in her hands. The dust on the latch had been bothering Miss Marple for a while now. It wasn't the type of dust that built up over time, nor was it the sort of thing left by an accidental touch. No, this was deliberate. Someone had moved it, and carefully. Back in the library, she knelt down again by the door, her fingers tracing the edge of the latch. The dust was fine, almost powdery. Like talcum powder, it didn't belong, especially in a house like this where things were too polished to let such an inconsistency slip by. She had glanced at it before, but now she took a closer look. The dust had been disturbed just enough to show that it wasn't natural. The faint pattern left behind suggested someone had placed their fingers there, had wiped or moved it intentionally. The more she looked, the more she realized that this wasn't the sort of oversight that a maid would miss. Whoever had done it had been trying to make sure no one could tell the door had been opened or closed recently. The kind of precaution someone would take when hiding their tracks. Someone who wasn't supposed to be in the room. Someone who wasn't meant to be seen. Miss Marple stood up slowly, her fingers lingering on the latch. The door was locked from the inside, yes, but the latch itself wasn't just a physical barrier. It was a marker, a way to obscure the truth. Whoever had gone through that door didn't want to be caught. It was a small detail, but sometimes the smallest details told the biggest stories. The afternoon was growing late when Miss Marple found the filing cabinet in the corner of the study. It was old, heavy, and slightly ajar, as if someone had hurriedly shoved it back in place without bothering to close it properly. The papers inside were stacked haphazardly, a jumble of family documents that seemed to have been left undisturbed for years. She began sifting through them slowly, her eyes scanning the letters, the ledgers, the receipts, all the things that no one cared about unless they were needed. But then, as she flicked through one particularly faded folder, she saw it. A birth record dated over 30 years ago. At first glance it seemed no different from the others, but as she read the name, Edward Winters, her pulse quickened. She turned the page and examined the delicate script, the name written in a smooth hand that carried an almost gentle finality to it. Edward Winters. The name was familiar, but the face wasn't. There had been no mention of an Edward, no third Winters sibling, until now. And yet here it was, in the official birth records, a name long buried by family tradition, the third twin erased from the family's story, cast aside like an afterthought. Miss Marple ran her finger over the faded letters, the weight of the discovery settling in her chest. It all clicked into place. Victor, Lawrence, and now Edward. The family had more secrets than she'd imagined, and the truth about Victor's death was tangled up in them all. A third Winters, hidden away, forgotten, perhaps for reasons far darker than anyone had let on. She sat back in the chair, the file in her hands, and stared out of the window. The evening light cast long shadows over the estate, but it was the darkness in the house that weighed heavier on her mind. Edward Winters was a ghost, but ghosts had a way of making themselves known when the time was right. As Miss Marple closed the folder, she felt the pieces of the puzzle begin to shift. The key, the dust on the latch, the missing child. Everything was starting to form a clearer picture. The truth was closer now, and Miss Marple knew it wouldn't take much longer before the past would come crawling back to reveal the secrets it had buried so deep. In the stillness of the library, she made a quiet promise to herself. She would find the truth, even if it meant uncovering every last secret the Winters family had tried so desperately to keep hidden. The morning light spilled through the heavy curtains of Briarwood Hall, casting long shadows on the oak-panelled walls. The place was as grand as it was oppressive. Each room a museum of wealth and secrets, each corridor a narrow passage of history. It was a house that had seen more than its fair share of drama, though most of it had been carefully tucked away in corners and forgotten by those with the means to keep it buried. Miss Marple, after a quiet breakfast alone, was ready to move past the surface level of the mystery. She was already several steps ahead, her mind occupied by things most would have dismissed. The portrait, the hidden child, the third Winters, whose name was now inked on a birth record. The time for waiting was over. It was time to search for the doorways that had been kept closed for too long. Her first stop was the caretaker, a weathered man named Briggs who had been with the family longer than most of the staff had been alive. His presence was quiet, his answers to Miss Marple's questions measured and deliberate, as if he was accustomed to people coming and going, but rarely paying attention to what lay beneath the polished surface. "Briggs, I wonder," Miss Marple began casually, her hands folded in front of her as they stood near the back of the house. "How long has Briarwood Hall had its peculiarities? The layout, I mean. It seems a bit labyrinthine." Briggs looked at her from under a heavy brow. His expression was impassive, but his eyes flickered with a touch of unease. It's an old house, ma'am. You can't spend more than a century under one roof without picking up a few quirks. Quirks? Yes, Miss Marple mused. But surely you've heard stories of hidden passages, doors that don't open the way they should, rooms that aren't on the map. Briggs hesitated for a moment too long. Some say the place has got its secrets, and I reckon there's a few doors that've been closed for a long time. If you start looking where you shouldn't, you might find something you won't like. Miss Marple nodded, giving him a polite, understanding smile. We've always found that houses like this seem to have their own language, don't they? Even the walls speak, if you listen closely. Briggs shifted his weight uncomfortably. Aye, well, it's been years since anyone thought to open them old doors, best left alone. But you've heard the stories, haven't you, Briggs? About the rooms that aren't quite right? Miss Marple's voice was soft, almost coaxing, as if she were recounting a childhood memory. He looked at her, clearly weighing his words. There's talk, sure. Some say there's a way through the old servants' quarters, a path no one uses any more. Been there since the house was built, but it's not my business. I see, Miss Marple said, standing a little straighter. Thank you, Briggs. You've been most helpful. The caretaker didn't look at her again as she walked away, but she noticed his gaze linger on the shadows behind her. His words had been careful, his reluctance too practiced. Miss Marple filed the information away. A secret passage, a path to places forgotten. She was certain now that Briarwood Hall's foundation wasn't just built on stone, but on layers of silence and perhaps even fear. Later, Miss Marple returned to the library. The bookshelves were as towering and immovable as she remembered them, lined with volumes of old leather and dust. There was something about the weight of the air in the room, a thick, unspoken tension that hung over everything. She had already examined the shelves once, but this time she approached with a more deliberate focus. Her fingers brushed lightly along the edges of the books, feeling for irregularities. A shelf here was slightly misaligned, the wood beneath it worn in places where it had been frequently touched. She pushed gently, then harder. It gave way with a soft creak. Behind the bookshelf was a narrow recess, the darkness within thick enough to swallow the light from the window. Miss Marple pulled the shelf back just far enough to reveal a narrow passageway hidden behind it. She paused, her heart quickening slightly, not from fear, but from the rush of discovery. The key had to fit here. It had to. She reached into her coat pocket, retrieving the ornate key she had found earlier. It seemed too small for such a substantial lock, but when she slid it into the hidden mechanism, it turned with a satisfying click. The door swung open. The passage was narrow, the air cool and musty. A faint smell of mildew lingered in the shadows. It was old. Old in the way that only things left forgotten for decades could be. The walls were stone, lined with cobwebs and dust. Miss Marple stepped inside cautiously, the echo of her footsteps following her like a ghost. It was clear now that this passage was no accident. It had been built for a purpose, a way to move unseen, a way to get from one part of the house to another without being detected. Her mind turned quickly over the implications. This was no mere decorative feature. Whoever had used it before had intended it to be a secret, and now it was hers to uncover. Her hand brushed against the wall, where faded marks were etched into the stone, the traces of old mechanisms, cogs perhaps, or hidden locks. Someone had used this passage to move through the house, and they'd made sure no one would know they had been there. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. The mystery of the locked room was more complicated than she had first thought. This wasn't just a hidden passage, it was a deliberate choice. Miss Marple moved deeper into the passage, her steps deliberate, her eyes scanning every inch. The passage twisted slightly, leading her to a small, low-ceilinged room that had long since been abandoned. Cobwebs hung in the corners, and the floor was dusted with the remnants of things long forgotten. But there, just ahead, was something that caught her attention. A series of faint scratches on the floor, recent enough to be noticed, but old enough to have been left unnoticed by anyone who wasn't paying attention. She crouched down, examining the markings. They were too regular to be accidental, like the track of something being dragged. But what? And why here, in this forgotten place? Miss Marple's mind worked quickly. The room was too small to hold anything of real importance, nothing except the passage itself. She rose and moved further down the corridor, following it as it bent again and then again. The passage continued to twist through the bowels of Briarwood Hall, leading her deeper into the hidden heart of the estate. Her thoughts raced ahead. She had seen enough. This passage, this secret, was a piece of the puzzle. The locked room wasn't just a clever ruse to mask a murder. It was a deliberate construction, a way to hide something more important. Someone had used this passage to come and go, to manipulate the house without being seen. The locked door had been part of the charade, but the passage was the real secret. And with it Miss Marple was beginning to see the shape of things, to see how everything, every secret, was connected. She knew now that the truth was hiding in plain sight. It had been all along. The answers were here, within these walls, waiting to be uncovered. The garden was as still as the house, the only movement the faint rustle of leaves caught by a passing breeze. Miss Marple walked slowly through the clipped hedges, her shoes barely making a sound on the gravel path. She had requested this meeting with Lawrence Winters with no more than a polite word in his ear. Her voice was calm when she'd asked, but her mind had been anything but. Lawrence was waiting at the far end, his back to the stone wall that bordered the garden. The family had little use for this part of the estate, but Miss Marple had found it quiet and private, perfect for a conversation that would require more tact than most. When he saw her approach, Lawrence straightened, his tall frame stiff with the tension Miss Marple had come to expect. His hands were clasped behind his back, his jaw tight. "Miss Marple?" he greeted her, his voice almost too formal, his eyes avoiding hers. "I didn't expect this." She smiled lightly. "You didn't expect to see me in a garden, Mr. Winters? I assure you it's a lovely one, rather neglected, but then I suppose that's the way of things around here." Lawrence's gaze flickered to the edges of the garden, then back at her. "What is it you wish to talk about, Miss Marple?" "I was hoping we could have a little chat about the house," she said, her voice smooth and casual, "about its layout and some of its more unusual features." He stiffened immediately, a quick shift in posture that told her more than words ever could. "I'm not sure I follow," he said, though there was a sharpness to his voice now. "So there's nothing unusual about Briarwood Hall. It's an old estate, yes, but—" "The hidden passages," Miss Marple interrupted, her tone soft but firm. "The ones no one talks about. I've heard whispers, Mr. Winters. Surely you've heard them too. About the secret corridors, the ways in and out of the rooms that aren't on any maps?" Lawrence's expression flickered. For a moment it was as though a shadow crossed his face, brief but noticeable. He swallowed and forced a smile. "You've been speaking to the staff, I see. Stories like that are, well, you know how people like to talk. This is an old house. It's full of history. History people like to embellish." "But you didn't answer my question," Miss Marple said, as if it were nothing more than a casual observation. "I'm not asking about stories, Mr. Winters. I'm asking about what's real. The passages, the doors hidden behind the walls." Lawrence shifted on his feet. He looked uncomfortable now, his usual composure cracking under the weight of her questions. "I'm afraid I don't know what you're talking about," he said, but the words came out more strained than confident. Miss Marple observed him closely, her sharp eyes not missing the way his hands twitched slightly behind his back. "Really? A house of this size, with so many rooms, and you don't know about a single hidden passage?" She allowed a pause, letting the silence press in between them. "I find that hard to believe, Mr. Winters. A house like Briarwood would have its secrets, wouldn't it? And surely you, as its owner, would be the one to know them." For a moment Lawrence didn't respond. His lips tightened, and he exhaled sharply through his nose, as though trying to regain control of the situation. "What do you want from me, Miss Marple?" Miss Marple folded her hands in front of her, her gaze steady. "Only the truth, Mr. Winters. I've been piecing together a few things, and I think you know more about this house and about your family than you're letting on. What's hidden here? What's been kept in the dark?" His eyes narrowed, and for a moment it seemed as though the conversation might take a darker turn. Then, just as quickly, the tension in his shoulders eased. He smiled tightly, but it didn't reach his eyes. "There's nothing more to know," Lawrence said, his voice smooth now, almost rehearsed. "You're looking for something that isn't there, Miss Marple. Trust me, it's not worth your time." She smiled back at him, the corners of her mouth curving ever so slightly. "Perhaps you're right, Mr. Winters. Or perhaps there's more than meets the eye, but I do appreciate you taking the time to speak with me." With that she turned on her heel and walked away, leaving Lawrence standing in the garden, his eyes following her retreating figure. The conversation had been less revealing than she'd hoped, but the way he reacted spoke volumes. He knew more than he was saying, and Miss Marple was certain now. His guilt, while not proven, was something she could feel in the air between them. That evening the study was dim and quiet, its usual formality overshadowed by the weight of what Miss Marple had uncovered. She had gathered the pieces, the portrait, the strange dust on the latch, the ornate key, and the hidden passage. The information had been fragmented, but now, with the pieces laid out before her, they were beginning to form something more coherent. The portrait had been the first clue, the extra figure in the background, the face of the third Winters. Edward, as she had suspected, his name, buried in the family's history, had led her to this moment. A child, possibly hidden, erased from the family's memory, now came into sharper focus. The dust on the latch. It had been disturbed intentionally, of that she was certain. Someone had opened that door recently, someone trying to hide their tracks. Lawrence had tried to brush off her questions, but his discomfort had been too obvious. He was hiding something. Then there was the key, the ornate key she'd found hidden away in a drawer. The fit was perfect for the hidden door she had uncovered behind the bookshelf. It had unlocked more than just a passage. It had unlocked a piece of the puzzle, a secret way in and out of the house, one that could have been used to move undetected, to set up a crime without leaving a trace. Miss Marple spread the documents she'd gathered on the desk, the birth records, the correspondence, the small details no one had thought to pay attention to. Everything pointed to a carefully orchestrated plan to conceal the truth, to keep things hidden. But why? Why erase Edward from the family's history? And why was Lawrence so intent on keeping the past buried? The answer was within reach. She could feel it. The connection between the hidden child, the passage, the locked door, and the motive for murder. Lawrence had tried to hide the truth, but Miss Marple wasn't about to let him get away with it. She sat back in her chair, her fingers tapping lightly on the edge of the desk. The truth was there, tangled in a web of deception, and Miss Marple was determined to untangle it. Tomorrow she would confront Lawrence once more. But this time she would have the upper hand. The pieces had fallen into place, and the game was about to reach its end. The grand drawing-room of Briarwood Hall was as opulent as ever, the flickering glow of the fire casting long shadows across the richly upholstered furniture. The polished hardwood floors, darkened with age, creaked faintly underfoot as the family and staff filed in. The room, heavy with its dark wood panelling and grandiose decor, was stifling despite the open windows. The air seemed thick with more than just the smell of the fire. There was a palpable sense of tension that clung to the room, a feeling that something was about to break. Miss Marple took a seat by the window, her eyes casually flicking between the occupants as they gathered. Lawrence Winters stood near the hearth, his shoulders stiff and his hands jammed in his pockets, his eyes darting nervously between the others. He didn't need to be told his guilt was suspected. His every movement screamed it. Yet he made no effort to hide it. His anxiety was as clear as the fine china on the table. Sir Julian Blake lounged by the mantelpiece, a glass of brandy in his hand. He didn't seem concerned, though there was an edge to his otherwise confident posture, a quiet alertness in his eyes that Miss Marple had come to recognise. It was the look of someone who didn't trust the situation, even if they weren't showing it outright. Dr. Evelyn Montague sat in a chair, her hands folded neatly in her lap. There was nothing visibly out of place about her. Her expression was a mask of composure, but Miss Marple had seen the faintest trace of fear, of guilt, behind her calm exterior. It was the kind of look that was hard to fake, but not impossible. The servants had been dismissed for the moment, but Miss Marple knew they would be just as integral to this scene as the family members themselves. For now, though, they remained out of sight, allowing the drama to unfold without their presence. Miss Marple watched them all, each one of them a thread in the tapestry of this family's dysfunction, each hiding something in plain sight. She let the silence settle in. The room's unease was thick enough to cut through. It was the perfect setting for the truth to come out, and she was going to make sure it did. "Well, Miss Marple," Lawrence finally spoke, his voice hoarse. "What is it that you've called us here for?" "Patience, Mr. Winters," Miss Marple replied gently. "All in good time." The tension simmered, and it was clear that not all of them could sit still for much longer. Sir Julian took another slow sip of his drink, his eyes never leaving Miss Marple. Dr. Montague's gaze flicked nervously toward Lawrence, but she said nothing. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation. Miss Marple waited for the last of the family to settle, her hands folded neatly in her lap before she spoke again. "Let us begin," she said, her voice smooth, unhurried. Miss Marple stood, not too quickly, but with enough purpose to draw the eyes of everyone in the room. Her expression remained calm, almost serene, as she began her explanation. She moved deliberately, not to rush, but to ensure everyone in the room could see the connections she had uncovered. "Each of you, in your own way, has tried to conceal the truth," she began. "But the truth, as it often does, finds a way of coming to light." She turned her gaze first to Lawrence. He stiffened but didn't speak. "The first clue, of course, was the portrait, the one you've all seen in the hallway," Miss Marple continued. "A portrait of two identical twins, Victor and Lawrence Winters. But as I examined it more closely, I saw something that you all seem to have missed. A third figure, barely visible in the background. A child. A third Winters child who, I believe, was erased from the family's history." The room went still. "The figure was there," Miss Marple continued. "Faint, ghostly, almost deliberately hidden, but unmistakably part of the family. His name, Edward Winters, appeared in the estate records. A name you did not want found. A third twin whose existence, for reasons we'll soon uncover, had to be forgotten." She paused, watching the reactions closely. Lawrence's face had gone pale, though he tried to mask it. Sir Julian's grip on his glass tightened slightly, and Dr. Montague shifted in her seat. Miss Marple moved on. "Then there was the key," she said, holding it up for them all to see. "An ornate key, found in an old desk drawer. Its design matched the latch of the library door, but it was too small to be an ordinary key. What it opened, I discovered, was a secret passage behind the bookshelf in the library." The room stiffened. No one spoke, but their faces betrayed them, eyes flicking nervously, hands gripping tightly at chair arms. "I found the passage hidden away for years. It's a narrow, musty corridor that leads through the estate, one that would allow for discreet movement, unseen and undetected," Miss Marple continued. "That key didn't just unlock a door. It unlocked a way to move through this house without ever being seen. The question, of course, is why it existed in the first place." She walked to the centre of the room, her hands still clasped in front of her. "And then there was the dust on the latch of the library door, untouched but clearly disturbed. Not just a mark of neglect, but a deliberate pattern. Someone had opened and closed that door recently and had tried to hide the fact that they'd done so. Miss Marple let the silence hang in the air before adding, "Who had the opportunity to use that passage? Who had access to it? Who could move freely in and out of the library without anyone noticing? And more importantly, who had something to gain by erasing Edward from the family's story?" She turned back to the others, watching their faces closely, letting the weight of her words sink in. "Victor Winters was murdered, yes, but not by the obvious suspect," Miss Marple said, her voice quiet but firm. "It wasn't Lawrence. It wasn't Dr. Montague. It was someone who wanted to cover up a family secret, a secret tied to Edward Winters." A pause. She looked directly at Lawrence. "You wanted to protect the family's reputation, didn't you? But it was never about Victor. It was about the past, about Edward. And you thought you could cover it up." The room was heavy with the sound of breathing. No one moved, not even Lawrence. Miss Marple took a step back, her gaze moving from one face to another. "This was never about murder. It was about a lie. A lie you've been living for far too long." She let the words linger in the air, each one a carefully placed stone in a puzzle that was now nearly complete. The web of deception was there for all to see, tangled up in family history, fear, and a deadly secret. And now the truth was finally coming to light. Lawrence took a deep breath, his face pale. "What are you saying?" His voice cracked, betraying his calm facade. Miss Marple gave him a small, almost pitying smile. "I'm saying, Mr. Winters, that you didn't just kill Victor. You killed Edward a long time ago." And just like that, the house, once full of shadows and lies, began to feel a little less dark. The air in the drawing room had thickened, the silence more oppressive than the heavy curtains drawn against the outside world. Miss Marple stood in the centre, surrounded by the expectant faces of the Winters family and their entourage. The tension was nearly unbearable. They had all gathered here under the guise of answers, but the truth was far from clear. Miss Marple's gaze swept the room, deliberately lingering on each person's face. Sir Julian Blake's hands were clasped behind his back, but his fingers twitched. Dr. Montague sat stiffly in her chair, eyes darting nervously, though her posture remained immaculate. Lawrence Winters stood by the hearth, his face pale, eyes darting from Miss Marple to the others, as if seeking something to cling to, but it was Lawrence's quiet, determined silence that betrayed him. There was too much calculation behind his eyes, too much fear. Fear of what Miss Marple would say next. "I'm sure," Miss Marple began softly, her voice cutting through the thick air with deliberate precision, "that you all have been wondering why we've come to this point, why the truth has been so elusive, why it has slipped through our fingers like sand." Her eyes shifted slightly to the corner of the room. "But the truth," she continued, her voice gaining strength, "has a way of making itself known even when we try to bury it." The room fell still as every eye followed her gaze. From the shadows, a figure stepped forward, slowly, deliberately. Edward Winters. The gasp that followed was like the snap of a taut string, sharp and sudden. The shock in the room was palpable, each breath a little harder, each heart rate a little quicker. Edward stood there, taller than the others, his features a perfect echo of Lawrence and Victor, but with something more sinister, a hardness to his jaw, a bitterness in his eyes. He was the same age as Lawrence, but there was a weariness to him, a marked absence that made his presence more unsettled. Miss Marple allowed the silence to settle before she spoke again, her voice unyielding. "Edward Winters, the third twin, the one who was erased, the one no one spoke of." Edward's eyes flitted to his brother, Lawrence, before quickly retreating to the floor. It was an almost imperceptible glance, but it didn't go unnoticed. "Edward, as you see, was the Winters family's well-kept secret," Miss Marple said, her words slow and deliberate. "But unlike the secrets you hide under rugs, Mr. Winters, this one didn't stay hidden for long." She turned her attention back to the room, letting the words sink in. "The motive, as you now know, is buried in a family history riddled with jealousy, resentment, and the hunger for something that was denied. The silence that followed her words was suffocating, as everyone struggled to digest the truth of what Miss Marple had just revealed. Edward looked at Lawrence now, his expression unreadable. "You don't understand," Edward said, his voice low but steady. "I was cast aside, a shadow, nothing more. You and Victor had everything, the legacy, the attention, the name, and I was left in the dark." There was a tremor in his voice now, but it was not one of fear, of guilt. It was the tremor of years of bitterness, years of being forgotten, years of being erased from the family's narrative. "Why kill Victor?" Dr. Montague finally spoke, her voice trembling but controlled. "Had nothing to do with it. You wanted the legacy, not his life." Edward's eyes flared with anger. "Victor stood in my way. It wasn't about the name. It was about being part of something real. I'd been left out. For so long I watched from the shadows as you all played your parts, living a life that should have been mine." His voice hardened as he turned his gaze toward Lawrence. "You for all people, Lawrence. You never even noticed. You only cared about what you could get. And when Victor and I were gone, you were ready to take the rest." Miss Marple's calm gaze never wavered. "Edward, it was never about Victor," she said quietly. "It was about you. You wanted something that you felt had been stolen from you, so you set the stage. You used the secret passage to enter and leave the locked room, framed Lawrence with every move. The dust on the latch was the final mark, evidence that you had been there, tampering with the truth." Edward's face fell, and for a brief moment he seemed smaller, as if the years of holding his resentment in check had drained him of his energy. "Why now?" Sir Julian spoke for the first time, his voice quieter, though no less accusatory. "Why, after all these years? Why bring it all to the surface now?" Edward's lips twisted into something between a bitter smile and a grimace. "Because it was never going to stay buried. Secrets have a way of festering, and when I saw my chance, I took it. I wanted to make sure the family couldn't continue their charade. I wanted to remind them all that there's always someone left behind, someone who won't be forgotten." His gaze turned back to Lawrence, softer now. "But I should have known," he whispered, almost to himself. "You are always going to win in the end, and I was just a ghost to you, a name on a piece of paper." Miss Marple looked around the room, her gaze sweeping over the stunned faces. "In the end, it wasn't murder that mattered, but the lie. The lie that was maintained at all costs. The Winters family wanted perfection. They wanted their image to stay untarnished, so they erased Edward's existence. But that lie cost Victor his life." She turned to Edward, who stood with his head lowered, his shoulders slumped. "That cost you your peace, but in the end it's the truth that has been revealed, and that, Mr. Winters, is the only thing that matters now." The room was silent again. No one moved. It was done. The truth had been exposed, and the family's tangled web of lies was now laid bare. Edward Winters was no longer a shadow in the background. He had stepped forward, and with him the long-buried past had come to light. As Miss Marple turned away, she felt a faint smile tug at the corner of her lips. The puzzle was complete. The drawing-room had descended into an uneasy silence, thick with tension and the weight of accumulated secrets. The fire crackled in the corner, but it hardly managed to warm the air. Everyone in the room was waiting, their gazes darting from one another to Miss Marple, who stood calmly at the centre, eyes fixed on Edward Winters. Edward, who had remained quiet through the long moments of revelation, looked like a man who had reached the end of a road. His usual composure, that mask of indifference, had crumbled away under the weight of Miss Marple's logic, her calm, unyielding interrogation. The questions had been asked in such a way that there was nowhere left to hide. He shifted, his fingers gripping the edge of a chair as he glanced from Lawrence to the others. It was clear that he had hoped this moment would never come, that the secret would remain his alone. But now, surrounded by the irrefutable evidence of his crime, the confession was inevitable. Edward's voice, when it finally broke the silence, was low and jagged, like someone who had been holding a breath too long. "And so he is true, then. You know everything." Miss Marple's gaze didn't falter. She stepped closer, her voice cool but firm. "Edward, I believe you've been trying to hide behind a lie for years, a lie that has cost both your brothers everything, and in the end it was Victor who paid the price." The words hung in the air. Lawrence, standing near the fireplace, stiffened but didn't speak. He could hardly believe what he was hearing, though deep down he knew that Miss Marple wouldn't make such accusations without cause. And now, as Edward's defences crumbled, Lawrence's face showed the faintest hint of relief. He had been guilty only of being a pawn in someone else's game. Edward looked down, his shoulders sagging. Before he looked up again, his eyes cold and empty. "I did it," he said, his voice steady but tinged with raw emotion. "I killed Victor, not because of some fleeting jealousy, not because I wanted his life. I did it because I wanted the life that had been denied me, the name, the legacy. You don't understand what it was like, being erased." His eyes flicked to Lawrence. "They told me I was nothing, that I didn't matter. But I mattered. I needed to matter." Miss Marple nodded slowly, as though she'd been waiting for him to admit it. "Tell me how you did it, Edward." Edward swallowed hard, but there was no more hesitation. The story spilled out, piece by piece. "It wasn't hard. I knew the house better than anyone. I knew the secret passage behind the library. No one had used it for years. It was the perfect way in. I'd seen the servants' whispers, heard the stories. They were all distractions. I used the poison, the one Victor had kept locked away. He thought it was a harmless remedy, a little tonic for his nerves, he said. But it was deadly, and I knew it." He paused, his eyes hardening. "I poisoned the drink. He never saw it coming. And then I left the room, just as I always knew I could. The door was locked from the inside. No one suspected it wasn't Victor who locked it. No one knew I had the key or the means to enter and leave without being seen." Miss Marple listened intently, her face inscrutable, but her mind worked quickly. The story was as she had suspected, carefully constructed, just enough to frame Lawrence, to make it look as if he had done it. She could see the intricate web Edward had woven, and for a moment she allowed herself a small sigh of satisfaction. "You used the hidden passage," she confirmed. "The same one I found behind the bookshelf. The dust on the latch was the final clue. Your carelessness in thinking it wouldn't be noticed. You used it to move freely between rooms, to leave the body without anyone seeing. The poison did its job, and when you returned to check on Victor, you locked the door behind you to make sure no one would ever know you'd been there." Edward nodded, his face twisted in a grimace. "It wasn't supposed to be this way. I only wanted what I was owed. The Winter's name, the Winter's fortune." Miss Marple paused. "And you thought that by killing Victor you'd reclaim it? By framing Lawrence, your surviving twin?" Edward's eyes darkened. "Yes, they'd believe anything. They'd blame him. He's always been the good one, the one who did everything right. But I was always there, watching, waiting." Miss Marple's eyes flicked to Lawrence, who had barely spoken throughout Edward's confession. He looked hollow, like a man who had been stripped of the weight of suspicion but hadn't yet found peace. "Lawrence," Miss Marple said quietly, "you're free of this. Edward's actions were his own." Lawrence didn't say anything at first. He only nodded slowly, his hand clenching and unclenching at his side. "I never knew," he finally muttered. "I never knew about Edward, not like this. But it makes sense, doesn't it, all these years?" Edward's jaw tightened, but he didn't look at his brother. "You don't get to absolve yourself, Lawrence," he spat, his voice thick with contempt. "You may have had the life, the attention, the family name, but you were never the one who mattered." Miss Marple stood there quietly for a moment before stepping forward. "The crime was committed with careful thought," she said, her voice steady. "But in the end it was fueled by years of resentment and a desire for something that was never truly his to claim." Edward's face twisted, and for a brief moment the bitter truth of it all seemed to sink in. He had done what he had done not out of love for anyone or anything, but out of an aching, hollow desire for validation, a desire to be seen, to matter. "Do you have anything to say for yourself, Edward?" Miss Marple asked, her voice calm. Edward looked at her, and for a moment the hardness in his eyes softened, but only for a moment. He finally spoke, his voice small and defeated. "I just wanted to be a part of it all, and I couldn't. I couldn't live in the shadow of someone else forever." Miss Marple nodded, her expression as steady as ever. "And that is why you killed him. The family secret was too much for you to bear. The weight of being forgotten was too heavy." Edward stood there, unable to meet anyone's gaze now. The truth had been exposed, and with it, the twisted web of family deception had unravelled. "Take him away," Miss Marple said, her voice quiet but firm. The constable, who had been waiting at the door, stepped forward, and with one final glance at his brother, Edward Winters was led away. The room was silent once again. But now there was a sense of finality in the air, an air that had been suffocating under the weight of the past. Miss Marple looked around at the gathered faces, now pale and strained. The tension that had filled the room had dissipated, but the lingering weight of the truth remained. Lawrence stood there, his face drawn, but the weight of guilt no longer on his shoulders. He had been the victim of a lie, and now that lie had been exposed for all to see. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, his voice hoarse. "I never knew." Miss Marple's gaze softened for a moment. "No one knew, Mr. Winters, not until now." She turned toward the door. "No, at last, you're free!" The door closed behind her, and Briarwood Hall was left to settle into its long-forgotten truths. The drawing-room of Briarwood Hall was quieter now, its opulence untouched by the emotional storm that had swept through it only hours earlier. The fire had burned low, casting flickering shadows across the grand furniture and polished floors. The windows were open, but the night air was still, as though the house itself had sighed in relief. The constable had escorted Edward Winters away, his arms stiff behind him, but there was no defiance left in him. His confession had stripped him of his arrogance, leaving only the hollow remnants of a man who had gambled everything on a lie. The others, still seated around the room, didn't speak immediately. Lawrence Winters sat by the window, his shoulders finally relaxed, his face pale but less haunted than it had been before. The weight of the false blame had been lifted, but the shadows of the past lingered in his eyes. He looked out at the garden, his gaze distant. Miss Marple stood near the fire, her hands clasped together in front of her, her expression thoughtful but not unkind. There was satisfaction in the resolution, but no joy. The truth, once revealed, didn't bring happiness. It brought only an ending, a recognition of what had been lost. Sir Julian Blake was leaning against the mantel, his brandy glass now empty, the gesture of a man who had witnessed something he hadn't quite expected, but had long suspected. He didn't show regret. He wasn't the type, but his lips were tight, his posture just a little less confident. He glanced at Lawrence but said nothing. Dr. Montague sat at the edge of her chair, her fingers twisting a handkerchief in her lap. Her eyes were downcast, as if she were trying to find some thread of comfort in the fabric. The shock of the revelation had affected her more deeply than she had let on. The truth about Edward, and the bitterness that had led to Victor's death, had shattered her carefully constructed detachment. "We've come to the end of it," Miss Marple said quietly, her voice cutting through the silence. "And yet, I think it's safe to say that none of you will leave here without something changed." Lawrence turned his head, his eyes meeting hers. "What happens now?" His voice was steady, but there was an edge of uncertainty to it. "Edward is gone, but the damage can't just disappear, can it?" Miss Marple shook her head slowly, the corners of her lips twitching, almost imperceptibly. "No, the past leaves its marks. The truth comes with its own price." She stepped toward him, her voice softening. "You're free of the guilt, Mr. Winters. The truth about your brother's death is known. No more shadows, no more false accusations. You'll no longer carry that burden." Lawrence exhaled slowly, his eyes closing for a moment. He didn't speak, but the tension in his shoulders eased a little. He hadn't realized how heavy the weight of suspicion had been until it was gone. Yet there was a look in his eyes, something between grief and understanding. He hadn't been entirely innocent in this family's drama, and he knew it. "Do you think," Dr. Montague's voice interrupted, shaky but clear, "that we'll ever truly be rid of this?" She looked up, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I didn't know. Miss Marple, I didn't know about Edward, about the—" "None of you did," Miss Marple said simply. "Oh, but it's the way of secrets, isn't it? They breed in silence, grow in the dark, and only come to light when the house can no longer hold them. You couldn't have known, Dr. Montague. None of you could." The words seemed to hang in the air for a moment, their truth sinking in. Sir Julian's lips tightened, and he took a slow step forward, his voice low and deliberate. "You're right, Miss Marple. We never saw it. We thought we knew the Winters family, Victor and Lawrence, the successful pair. Edward was always the forgotten one. And that was his curse," Miss Marple said, her gaze flicking to Lawrence. "Edward was never truly seen, and the family's efforts to keep him buried only made his resentment grow. But in the end, it was his actions that sealed his fate." Lawrence turned his head, meeting Sir Julian's eyes briefly. "I never knew. I never suspected." Sir Julian nodded, his face grim. "None of us did. We were too busy with our own lives to see the cracks forming." The room lapsed into silence again. For a while no one spoke. There was a certain finality to it, a quiet acceptance of what had happened and what couldn't be undone. The family had been shattered, their reputations tarnished by a lie that had run deeper than they had ever imagined. Miss Marple turned back to the fire, her gaze lost in the flames. "But there is something else, isn't there?" The room shifted, everyone's attention snapping back to her. She didn't turn, but her voice rang clear. Eric's death may have been the culmination of a series of unfortunate events, but it wasn't just about revenge, it was about power, control. The Winters family built its foundation on certain principles, and Edward's death was an attempt to force the family back into the mold he thought they owed him. But in the end, it didn't work. His actions only buried him deeper. Her words seemed to sink in. Sir Julian looked away, his jaw clenched tight. Dr. Montague wiped her eyes, her hand shaking. Lawrence, still standing by the window, seemed lost in thought, as though trying to make sense of a world that had been turned upside down. "None of us were innocent in all this," Lawrence said, finally breaking the silence. "We all had our part in making this family what it is, and now—" "Now," Miss Marple said gently, "you can rebuild. You can live with the truth, even if it's uncomfortable. The question, Lawrence, is not whether the truth will heal you. It's whether you're willing to face it, completely." Lawrence nodded slowly, the weight of it finally settling on his shoulders. "I'll try," he said, his voice quiet. "I'll try to make it right." Miss Marple gave him a slight, approving nod. She knew it wouldn't be easy. No one ever truly emerged from a situation like this unchanged, but sometimes the hardest part wasn't solving the mystery. It was facing what lay beneath the surface, in the depths of the human heart. She glanced at the others, then looked back at the fire. For the first time in days, the room felt still, at peace, if only for a moment. The truth had been laid bare, and while the scars would remain, there was a certain clarity in the air now. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and sometimes Miss Marple thought that was enough. The garden at Briarwood Hall was untouched by the day's earlier tension. The high hedges and clipped pathways provided a sense of order, though Miss Marple knew better. Beneath the surface of everything, secrets festered. But for now the garden was peaceful, a calm after the storm. The air was thick with the scent of lavender, and the only sounds were the soft hum of bees in the flowers and the rustle of the wind through the trees. Miss Marple had invited a few members of the family to join her, each one of them still processing the revelations of the last hours. Their faces, some of them pale, some guarded, all of them showing signs of the weight of what had been uncovered, were softened by the quiet of the garden. Lawrence Winters had come first, his steps slow as if he carried the weight of the past on his shoulders. He settled beside Miss Marple, his hands folded neatly in his lap. He had the look of a man who had just realized how little he truly knew about his own life. "Miss Marple," he said, after a long silence, his voice still tight, "I'm grateful for everything you've done, but there's still a part of me that can't shake it. The guilt, the weight of what happened." Miss Marple glanced at him with a soft, almost knowing smile. "You were never guilty, Mr. Winters," she said gently. "He was simply a man caught in a trap laid by someone else. Edward's actions were his own." Lawrence stared ahead, his gaze distant. "I should have seen it, should have known there was something wrong, but I didn't." His voice caught. "How could I not know my own brother?" Miss Marple's voice was calm but firm. "Sometimes, Mr. Winters, the truths we most need to see are the ones we choose not to awe. Or perhaps the ones we never thought to ask." He turned to look at her then, the hint of a smile on his lips. "Perhaps," he said, his voice softer now. "I'll have to learn to live with it, the truth." She nodded, her eyes thoughtful. "Truth doesn't always make things right, but it does clear the air, and sometimes that's enough." They sat in silence for a moment, letting the garden settle around them. Lawrence seemed to take comfort in the stillness, the gentle rhythm of the world moving on, even after the chaos had passed. Dr. Montague arrived next, her steps measured, her face still holding the remnants of her earlier distress. She glanced at Miss Marple, a silent question in her eyes, but Miss Marple only gestured to the empty seat beside her. "I didn't know," Dr. Montague said quietly as she sat. "I never knew about Edward. Not like that. I always thought he was just another ghost story, a rumor, a past left buried. But now I wonder if I ever really knew the Winters family at all." Miss Marple gave her a warm, understanding look. "You never could have known, Dr. Montague. Not all families are as they appear, not even to those closest to them." Dr. Montague sighed, her eyes distant. "I thought I understood Victor, but perhaps I was just seeing what I wanted to see." "There's nothing wrong with wanting to believe the best of someone," Miss Marple said, her voice quiet but firm. "But the truth, however painful, has a way of making itself known, whether we're ready for it or not." Dr. Montague shifted in her seat, glancing at Lawrence. "And now we rebuild," Miss Marple said. "We face what's been revealed and move forward, one step at a time." The conversation faded as they both absorbed the quiet of the garden. The rustle of leaves, the distant call of birds settling in for the night, were the only sounds that remained. As dusk settled over Briarwood Hall, the garden took on a shadowed, reflective quality. The air was cooler now, the soft light from the setting sun casting long shadows across the path. Miss Marple sat alone on a secluded bench at the far end of the garden, the cool stone beneath her back offering little comfort, but her mind was far from the garden's beauty. She could hear the echoes of the day's events, the sharp confessions, the tense confrontation. She thought about the family she'd just left behind, their faces softened with the weight of their secrets, their loss, and the long, hard path ahead. Each of them had been affected by Edward's actions, but none of them had truly known what was hidden beneath the surface of their home. The murder had been just the beginning of a much deeper web, one of lies and old wounds that never healed. Edward's rage had been years in the making, and in the end it had brought nothing but ruin. But the family, at least, had a chance to rebuild. They could live with the truth now. She thought about the human heart and its complexities, the ways people deceive themselves, the lengths they'll go to protect their own. It wasn't always malicious. Sometimes it was simply fear that drove people to conceal what they didn't want to face. Miss Marple sighed, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She'd done her job, uncovered the truth, and unravelled the lies. Yet there was always something else beneath it, something that couldn't be easily explained. People, she thought, were always more complicated than they appeared. And the house, Briarwood Hall, with its secrets and its shadows, had revealed only a fraction of what was buried there. She looked out over the garden, her mind still working, but with a gentler pace now. The wind had picked up, and the trees swayed as the last of the sunlight disappeared behind the horizon. "In every hidden corner of the heart and home," she murmured softly to herself, "truth waits patiently to be discovered." The night had settled in, but for Miss Marple the quiet unravelling of secrets would always be the most satisfying part of the job.